HOA Karen tried to claim my shoreline as community property. I'm Elias, and this is the story of how an HOA president tried to take my lakefront, built a dock on my land, and even called 911 when I tore down her illegal mess. I thought it was just another HOA shakedown, until investigators found forged maps, missing money, and a trail that led all the way to the governor's desk. If you've ever stood your ground against someone abusing their power, drop a yes in the comments, and hit subscribe to follow more true stories of land, justice, and what happens when you refuse to be pushed off your own property. The gravel popped under my truck tires as I rolled down the last bend toward my lake cabin. That familiar little dip in the road where the pine trees parted, just enough to give me the first glimpse of water. After 2 weeks working a contract job down at the Hungry Horse Dam, 12-hour shifts, cold metal scaffolds, the nonstop hum of turbines, I was craving nothing but silence, warm coffee, and the worn cedar deck of the place I'd called home for 8 quiet years. But the moment the lake came into view, something felt wrong. Off, like a picture frame tilted just enough to make your eye twitch. I slowed to a crawl. There, cutting through the silver-blue water like some unwanted scar, stretched a long wooden dock. Not a small fishing pier or a family project. This thing was 30 feet long, built from fresh lumber, the color still pale with sawdust. It reached straight out from my shoreline, as if someone had chosen my backyard, my private waterfront, as their personal launching pad. For a moment I thought maybe fatigue was playing tricks on me. 2 weeks of dam noise will do that to a man. I blinked hard, leaned forward, squinted through the windshield. But it was real. Bolted in. Planked tight. Anchored deep. An entire structure that hadn't existed when I locked my cabin door and left town. Rusty, my old red heeler, lifted his head from the passenger seat and whined low in his throat. Even he knew something wasn't right. I parked beside the cabin, stepped out, and the mountain air hit me, cold, clean, sharp with the smell of pine. Normally it settled me. Today it only pointed out the wrongness drifting on the water. The lake was calm, barely rippling, but that dock sat heavy and smug like it belonged, like it had grown roots overnight. I walked down toward the shoreline, boots brushing through the frost-tipped grass. Each step made my jaw tighten a little more. This was private land. My land. I'd bought this place with the money from 25 years of engineering dams, calculating pressures and load paths, solving problems other folks wouldn't touch. The cabin was my retreat from all that math and machinery. A single slice of Montana quiet I didn't share with anyone. And now someone had hammered a full dock into it like it was free property. Rusty trotted along behind me, tail stiff, ears forward. Even he was on alert. As I reached the start of the dock, I crouched and placed a hand on one of the support posts. The wood was new, smooth, still smelled faintly of resin, and the bolts, galvanized hex bolts, sat flush against the grain. Someone had done this fast, but not cheap. Then I noticed the footprints, not mine. Work boot treads stamped into the soil, leading down the slope from the road. A whole crew had been here, right on my property line, and I hadn't received a single call, text, or courtesy notice. A voice cracked across the water, sharp and grating enough to turn my spine rigid. "So you're back early?" I exhaled slow. Just my luck. Miranda Kessler stood at the top of the slope, hand on her hip, the other holding a clipboard like it was a badge. Bleach blonde bob, oversized sunglasses, pink windbreaker that didn't quite zip over her pride. Willow Shore's HOA president, 53 years old, and a menace. I straightened. "Miranda." She started down the slope toward me, every step crunching like an accusation. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, gesturing at the dock as if she'd gifted me a luxury boat slip. "What is this?" I asked, keeping my voice level. "A community dock," she replied with a smile thin as fishing line. "The board approved its construction while you were out of town. Our lakeside needs updated amenities. Your board can't approve structures on land you don't own." She waved her hand as if brushing aside a fly. "Oh, don't start with legalese, Elias. The community needed this. You weren't here. We moved forward." I stared at her for a long second. "You built a 30-foot dock on my private shoreline without permission." "It benefits everyone," she said, her voice rising. "And as HOA president, I have the authority to enforce community improvements." "That's not how authority works." Her smile hardened. "If you touch a single board, Elias, you'll be fined for destruction of HOA property and obstruction of community assets." There it was, that smug threat, polished from years of bossing folks around who never fought back. She liked control, liked intimidation, liked believing she owned anything her clipboard pointed at. Behind her, the lake glimmered under the morning sun, as if mocking the absurdity of the moment. I kept my breath steady. Years of engineering, emergency maintenance, and field inspections had taught me how to slow time in my head, how to think when others panicked or yelled. "Miranda," I said quietly, "this wasn't your land to build on." She lifted her chin. "Well, it is now, and any refusal to cooperate will be handled through enforcement." Rusty let out a low growl. I didn't blame him. I didn't argue, didn't shout, didn't give her the satisfaction of riling me up. Instead, I stepped back, letting the cold wind curl around us, carrying the scent of lake water and fresh cedar. I simply looked at the dock again. Those bolts, the fresh cuts, the unauthorized footprint, and something deep in my chest tightened, not with rage but with certainty. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't ignorance. It was intentional. I turned away without another word and started back toward the cabin. Miranda scoffed behind me, muttering something I didn't bother to catch. But a question settled heavy in my mind, heavier than any plank on that dock. Why would an HOA build on land they didn't own? And why target my lakefront out of all the places on this shore? The answer, I felt, wasn't going to be simple, and it sure as hell wasn't going to be pretty. By the next morning, the lake had gone still, smooth as glass, the kind of calm that pretends nothing happened. But when I opened my cabin door, the entire world had changed. 3 bright orange envelopes were taped to my porch rail, their corners fluttering in the cold wind like warning flags on a battlefield. Rusty barked once, sharp and irritated, as if the colors offended him. I pulled the first envelope free. Violation Notice Number 117B, Obstruction of Community Asset. The second, Violation Notice Number 203F, Unsafe Shoreline Conditions. And the third, the one that made my jaw lock tight. Violation Notice Number 412K, Aggressive Behavior toward HOA Personnel. Aggressive. I laughed once, dry as timber. I'd barely spoken 10 sentences to Miranda yesterday. Yet here it was, her signature in blue ink at the bottom of every paper, each stroke more dramatic than the last, like she enjoyed signing her name on trouble. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of wet pine and distant chimney smoke. I stepped off the porch and heard the crunch of gravel behind me. A white SUV rolled slowly down the narrow road, creeping by like a gator in shallow water. On the door, a magnetic sticker read, "Willow Shores Compliance, Road Patrol." The man inside held a camera pointed at my cabin, then swiveled it to my truck, then to me. He didn't wave, didn't nod. Just pressed the shutter button a few more times like he was documenting a crime scene. When our eyes met, he lowered the camera, scribbled something on a notepad, and drove off, dust rolling behind him in the golden morning light. I exhaled. So this was the next move. Inside the cabin, I laid the violation papers on my kitchen table. Rough-cut pine, knots still dark from years of oiling. Beside them, I spread out the documents I kept in a weatherproof case. My deed, the original plat map from the purchase, and the supplemental shoreline boundaries issued by the county's Water Rights Office. Rusty sat beside me, tail gently thumping against the floor. "Look here," I said to no one but him, tapping the plat map. 10 feet into the lake, that's all mine. I traced the boundary line with my finger, the line Miranda had either ignored or deliberately crossed when she placed her dock. Yesterday, I'd suspected carelessness. Today, seeing the violations lined up in a perfect stack, I knew better. This wasn't carelessness. This was strategy. Wind pushed against the cabin siding, carrying a colder scent, snow waiting in the mountains. I'd spent enough winters in Montana to recognize that bite. I was staring out the window, watching the water ripple, when a soft knock came at the door. Rusty perked up, ears alert. I opened it to find Mrs. Halpern, a widow who lived 2 houses down. She clutched a tattered cardigan around her and looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Elias, she whispered, voice barely above the wind. "I thought you should know. Miranda's been telling folks you threatened her yesterday. Said you raised your voice, got in her face." I blinked. I didn't even step toward her. "I know," she said quickly, glancing over her shoulder. "But she was at my house this morning. Made it sound like you're some kind of danger to the community." Her fingers trembled as she held out a folded paper. I opened it. A printed memo, stamped with the HOA logo. Community alert, resident safety notice, subject. Concerning behavior from Lakefront owner. Heart pounding, I scanned for my name. It was there, bolded. "She's trying to isolate you," Mrs. Halpern whispered. "If you need help, you let me know." I thanked her, and she hurried off down the path like she didn't want anyone to see her talk to me. The moment she disappeared, my cabin felt smaller, tighter, like Miranda was already pushing against the walls. I grabbed my coat, deed folder, and a pair of reading glasses I barely used. Then I headed down the gravel drive toward my truck. Rusty hopped in beside me before I even whistled. "County office first," I muttered, starting the engine. The smell of old leather and motor oil wrapped around me. Comfort, familiarity. As I drove past the neighboring cabins, blinds shifted, faces peaked, conversations stopped mid-sentence. The entire place felt like a small theater where I'd suddenly been cast as the villain. The county building sat 30 minutes away, tucked against the base of a mountain ridge. I walked in, boots echoing against cold linoleum, and approached the zoning desk where a woman with a neat braid and sharp eyes glanced up. "Morning," I said. "I need to speak with someone about unauthorized construction on private shoreline." She raised an eyebrow. "What kind of construction?" "A dock, 30 feet. Permits filed?" "That's the thing. I didn't file them." Her eyes narrowed. "Name?" "Elias Ward." She flipped through the computer, fingers tapping quickly. Then she frowned. "Nothing. No permits, no applications, no easements, nothing under your parcel or the HOAs." I felt a cold thump in my chest. "So it's illegal?" "Completely," she said. "If it touches your land without approval, that's trespassing. If it disturbs shoreline vegetation, it's a state-level issue." I handed her a printed boundary map. She studied it, then whistled softly. "They built it right into your private water rights zone, and they submitted nothing." A pulse of heat crawled up my neck, anger, steady and controlled. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "Document everything," I said, "and officially." By the time I walked back out into the cold noon light, I had a folder full of stamped copies, a file number, and a promise that the county would review the matter immediately. Snow clouds were rolling off the mountains now, curling low like smoke. Rusty whined beside the truck, sensing the tension shifting in the air. I placed the folder on the passenger seat and rested my hand on it. The wind rattled the dry branches overhead like bones. Miranda had opened a fight she thought she could win, with signatures and scare tactics. But now I had proof, and I wasn't about to roll over. As I started the engine, a thought crept in. Quiet, dangerous, undeniable. Why build a dock here? On my property? What exactly was she trying to gain from it? I didn't know yet. But whatever the reason was, it wasn't harmless, and it was about to unravel a whole lot more than she expected. By the time I got home, clouds hung low over the lake like a heavy gray blanket, and a thin wind rippled across the surface. Rusty hopped out of the truck before I shut the door, pacing along the shoreline with restless circles. He felt the shift in the air just as much as I did. The dock sat there, bold, wrong, defiant, stretching into the water like a finger jabbed into my chest. I stood there for a long minute, the cold biting through my coat, breathing in the damp smell of lake water mixed with the rough tang of freshly cut lumber. My hands tightened at my sides. Enough waiting. Enough warnings taped to my railing. Enough lies being passed around by a woman who thought a clipboard gave her divine authority. I went to my workshop behind the cabin, a simple shed with a tin roof, stacked with tools I trusted more than most people. I pulled out gloves, my cordless drill, a crowbar, a pry bar, and a bucket of galvanized screws. Not because I needed extras, just because having them close reminded me that I was doing this by the book. Every step measured, every bolt accounted for. Rusty followed me to the dock, ears perked. "Let's get started," I murmured. The first bolt came out easily, too easily. Whoever built this rushed the job. They cared more about speed than craftsmanship. The metal squeaked as I backed it out, the sound echoing across the quiet water. I set the bolt in a small box beside me. Every piece I removed would be saved, not destroyed, not discarded, but documented. The second bolt resisted, groaning before snapping free. Rusty barked once as the plank shifted, splashing a thin sheet of water upward. The cold droplets hit my boots, but I barely noticed. By the fifth plank, I could feel eyes on me. Across the lakefront, curtains twitched. A man I'd never seen before stood on his porch pretending to check his mailbox. Two teenagers paused their bikes on the gravel road, staring openly. And then I heard her voice. "Oh, for God's sake, what do you think you're doing?" I didn't look up yet. I finished pulling the final screw from the plank I was working on, then lifted the wood and set it on the grassy bank. Only then did I turn. Miranda Kessler was power walking down the slope like she was arriving at an emergency board meeting. Not an actual emergency, mind you, just the thrill of inserting herself. Her sunglasses were perched high on her forehead, her hair sprayed stiff enough to survive a hurricane, and her mouth curled into the kind of disapproving frown you only see on judges or people who have never been told no. "I'm cleaning up my shoreline," I said, wiping my gloves. "You're destroying HOA property," she hissed. "You're committing vandalism in broad daylight." "Not vandalism," I said calmly. I stepped aside and pointed at the freshly reinstalled orange survey flags marking the property line. "The entire dock sits on my land. These planks? My water rights zone. This shoreline? My deed." She glared at the flags like they were traitors. "You can't just tear this down," she snapped. "This dock was approved by a unanimous board vote." "On land you don't own," I reminded her. "You weren't here to object when the project timeline began." I let out a breath. "Miranda, you knew exactly what you were doing." Her jaw clicked. The wind whipped across the lake, carrying a shiver right through the conversation. She jabbed a finger at the lumber stacked beside me. "We spent thousands on that. Thousands. You don't get to keep HOA property. Return those materials or fines will be multiplied." I walked past her and loaded another plank onto the flatbed trailer, parked beside the cabin. Rusty padded behind me. Miranda turned, tracking every step. "You're making a mistake, Elias," she said sharply. "A big one. Once the board meets, you'll wish you'd listened." I didn't bother turning around. If you had built it somewhere else, maybe I wouldn't be out here dismantling it. Somewhere down the gravel road, a door slammed. Two neighbors retreated inside like they didn't want to witness what came next. I returned to the dock, kneeling at the next junction where the boards met the support beam. The metal was cold beneath my fingers, and the lake reflected the gray sky in broken mirror pieces. "You'll be hearing from our attorney," she spat. "Good," I said quietly as I loosened the next bolt. "He can explain trespassing laws to you." For a moment, silence settled, heavy, final. Then Miranda turned on her heel and stormed back up the slope, the wind tearing at her jacket. She muttered something about ungrateful hermits and danger to the neighborhood, but the words washed into the lake like mud. It took me nearly 2 hours to finish. Board by board, bolt by bolt, the dock shrank until nothing but the skeleton remained. I dismantled the frame, lifted the final post, and carried it to the trailer. Everything accounted for, everything salvaged, nothing damaged beyond retrieval. When I strapped down the last beam, I paused. A strange stillness settled over the water. The lake looked right again, quiet, undisturbed, its surface smooth except for the ripples Rusty made lapping from the edge. But the air felt different, charged, like the moment before a storm breaks open. As I walked back toward the cabin, a flicker of movement caught my eye. Miranda at the top of the road, talking in frantic gestures to someone inside a parked car. The window was rolled down, and a clipboard rested against the driver's lap. Not a neighbor. Not anyone I recognized. And definitely not someone here for friendly conversation. Rusty stood at my side, ears pricked, a low rumble in his throat. Whatever conversation Miranda was having, it wasn't casual. She kept pointing toward my cabin, then toward the now empty shoreline, anger written in every line of her body. I had dismantled her dock. I had exposed her lie. And she was already planning her next move. The dock might have been gone, but the fight had only just begun. The next morning, the sky hung low like wet wool, gray enough to swallow the tops of the pines. Rusty paced at the door before I'd even filled my first cup of coffee. Something unsettled him, ears up, tail stiff, eyes fixed on the gravel road. When I stepped onto the porch, the cold wind hit me with a sharp sting. The world smelled of damp earth, wet bark, and the faint metallic scent you get before snow. That's when the SUV came into view. White, spotless, crawling down the lane like a patrol vehicle trying not to look like one. It stopped at the edge of my drive. A man stepped out. Khakis, navy polo, clipboard tucked under his arm, and on the chest of his shirt, a cheap-looking badge embroidered with Willow Shores Compliance Division. My stomach dropped. This wasn't county. This wasn't state. This was HOA theater, dressing intimidation as authority. He didn't even introduce himself, just started snapping pictures of my flatbed trailer stacked with the dock lumber. He circled it twice, crouched once, even squinted as if measuring the shadows cast by the beams. Then he scribbled something on his clipboard, tore off a page and walked toward my mailbox. Rusty barked hard. The man ignored him. He slid a bright orange paper into the metal slot, slapped the mailbox door shut, and walked back to his vehicle without a word. Only when the SUV turned around and disappeared into the tree line did I pull the paper free. Violation notice. Immediate fine. Unauthorized possession of HOA construction materials amount. Due, $500 deadline, 5 days. Failure to comply will result in enforcement action. Below it, a thin printed signature. Compliance Officer J. Tillman. The letterhead tried to mimic a government citation, bold serif font, seal-like logo, but the logo was slightly crooked, and the formatting was off, margins uneven like someone who didn't understand document templates had tried their best. I let out a slow breath, folded the paper once, then walked around to the back of my shed. The wind hummed through the pine needles overhead. Rusty followed close behind. I knelt by the fire pit, a ring of stones I'd stacked the first week after buying the cabin. I tossed the violation onto the cold ash. Then I struck a match and let the flames swallow the counterfeit authority one corner at a time, until it curled into blackened lace and vanished. Enough was enough. I went back inside, grabbed my deed folder, the shoreline plat map, the printed survey boundaries, and the USB drive with camera footage showing the HOA crew hauling lumber across my lawn. I packed everything neatly into a weatherproof case and loaded Rusty into the truck. We drove to the county courthouse through gusts of wind that pushed across the road like invisible waves. Snowflakes flirted with the air, small, tentative. The kind of snow that says I might settle if you give me a reason. Inside, the courthouse smelled of old paper and polished tile. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A woman at the zoning counter, dark hair, crisp uniform shirt, nameplate reading Jasmine Ryle, looked up as I approached. "Morning," she said. "Need assistance?" I placed the folder on the counter. Unauthorized construction on my lakefront, built by the HOA while I was out of town. No permits, no easements. It intruded into my private water rights zone. Her eyebrows rose. "That's a serious claim." I brought proof. I laid the documents out. Deed first, then the plat map, then the boundary stamps. Each page looked cleaner and more legitimate than every violation the HOA had slapped on my property. Jasmine examined them slowly, tracing the shoreline boundary with a fingertip. The room felt painfully silent, as if the whole courthouse held its breath. "This is valid," she said at last. "Very valid. And if they built a structure here without filing anything..." She let out a long exhale. "That's not just an HOA problem. That's a zoning and environmental issue." "Can you confirm no permits were filed?" I asked. She typed quickly, eyes narrowing as she read the screen. "Nothing from you. Nothing from them. Nothing from any contractor in Willow Shores." "Then their dock was illegal," I said. "More than illegal." She closed the file with a soft thump. "That lake is protected watershed. Any shoreline modification requires county review and EPA notice. You said they drove pilings in?" "Deep enough to disturb the sediment," I replied. Her shoulders tightened. "Then they may have violated federal environmental regulations." A gust of wind rattled the courthouse windows, like the outside world agreed. Jasmine slid a form toward me. "I'm opening a formal zoning report. We'll need photos, timestamps, footage, everything you've got." I handed her the USB drive. She plugged it into her computer. Within seconds, she leaned closer to the screen. "They brought lumber onto your lawn," she murmured. "Multiple entries, no safety gear, no site markers. This is reckless." Rusty sat at my heel, watching her carefully. "Mr. Ward," she said, turning back to me, "I'm initiating a code enforcement review and notifying the Environmental Board. With your permission, we may need to contact law enforcement if property lines were violated." "You have my permission," I said. Her expression softened, more human now. "Prepare yourself. HOAs like this, they don't back down easily." "I'm not asking them to back down," I replied quietly. "Just to step back from what isn't theirs." When I left the courthouse, clouds had thickened into a heavy, brooding ceiling. More neighbors were out than usual, walking their dogs, sweeping porches, rearranging things that didn't need rearranging. Some looked away when I drove by. Others stared too long. Rumors traveled faster in small communities than weather. As I pulled into my drive, something caught my eye. A letter tucked under a stone by the steps. I picked it up, unfolded it. Typed, anonymous. Your recent behavior has drawn unnecessary attention. Return the materials. Apologize. Do not escalate further. For the good of the community. No signature. No address. No courage behind the words. I slid the letter into my expanding file labeled HOA Shenanigans and looked out toward the empty shoreline, where the lake lapped gentle waves against the undisturbed soil. Miranda had thrown everything she had into intimidation. Violations, fake compliance officers, anonymous threats. But she'd made her mistake early. She built her lies on my land. And once the government stepped in, lies never lasted long. The next morning came colder than usual, the kind of cold that slid under the doors and settled deep in the wood grain of the cabin. Frost gathered around the edges of the windows, framing the view of the lake in thin white veins. Rusty stood at the glass, tail low, ears perked, watching something moving by the shoreline. I stepped out onto the porch, the boards creaking under my weight. The air smelled of damp pine and the faint metallic promise of snow. Down by the water, a county truck idled quietly, steam puffing from its exhaust in slow bursts. Beside it stood Jasmine Ryle, the zoning officer, clipboards tucked under her arm. With her were two others, a county surveyor with a laser scope and a sheriff's deputy chewing on the stem of a pen. Their boots crunched across the frosted grass as they approached the waterline. I headed down the slope to meet them, Rusty trotting close behind. "Morning, Mr. Ward," Jasmine called, breath clouding in the cold. "Morning," I replied. "Didn't expect you so soon." "Given what you reported," she said, "we fast-tracked the inspection." The surveyor, a tall man with wind-chapped cheeks, pulled a few stakes from a canvas bag slung over his shoulder. "We'll be marking out your official property line," he said. "Shoreline's always tricky, but your documentation is clear." He set up a tripod with a laser crosshair device, its soft red beam flickering across the grass. The deputy walked beside him, snapping photos. The wind picked up, sending ripples through the lake. Miranda's dock had been gone for 2 days now, but the earth still held the scars. Small depressions where the pilings had been driven in, churned mud where vegetation had been disturbed, a faint chemical smell where treated lumber had sat too long. "What exactly are you looking for?" I asked. "Any sign of environmental disruption," Jasmine said, crouching near the water's edge. "This lake is part of a protected watershed. No construction allowed without review." She pointed to a cluster of flattened reeds. "This is new. And these?" She indicated dark streaks along the soil. "Treated wood leaching into shoreline sediment." The surveyor hammered a stake into the ground with a clean, sharp strike. Thunk, another, thunk, another, thunk. Each stake defined a piece of truth Miranda couldn't wiggle out of. Not with fake citations. Not with anonymous threats. Not with her board whispering behind curtains. After 20 minutes, the deputy took a final series of photos, each angle capturing the stakes, the lake, the disturbed ground. "Mr. Ward," he said, sliding the pen from his mouth, "you want to press trespassing charges?" The question hung in the cold air like a breath waiting to freeze. I paused, glancing over the waterline. As tempting as it was to say yes, the timing wasn't right. Not yet. "Let's see how they react to this," I said. "I want the investigation to run its course." The deputy nodded. "Fair enough." Just then, movement caught my eye. A cluster of figures up on the road. 3 neighbors bundled against the cold, pretending to walk their dogs. Except they weren't walking anywhere. They were watching, studying the stakes, the county truck, the officers. Their expressions were tight, uncertain, as if they were trying to understand which way the wind was shifting. The surveyor packed up his gear. "We'll file our report with the county today," he said. "Expect follow-up from environmental and legal." As they headed back to the truck, Jasmine lingered. "Mr. Ward," she said, lowering her voice, "you should know. We've had complaints about Willow Shores before. Mostly petty stuff, Mailbox height, flower beds, noise disputes. That sounds right, I muttered. But this? She motioned toward the shoreline. This is different. This is serious. And the paper trail you provided, it lines up with some irregularities on our side. Permits that should exist but don't. Payments that don't match project codes. My brow furrowed. You're saying this dock might be part of a bigger issue? She nodded. These things start small, but embezzlement, misuse of dues, falsified maps, they usually show up in patterns. The cold wind carried her words across the lake like a warning. I'll be in touch, she said, heading back to the truck. When they drove off, the shoreline felt somehow different, marked, claimed, no longer a silent victim of Miranda's power grab. The lake reflected the pale winter light, shimmering against the stakes now standing where the illegal dock had been. As I turned to head back up the slope, something caught my eye. A thin piece of paper tucked under a stone near the top of the steps leading to my cabin. Rusty barked when he saw it, as if recognizing a scent he didn't trust. I picked it up. Another typed note. Your actions threaten the harmony of Willow Shores. Stop causing trouble. Return what you took. Issue a formal apology. Do not escalate further. This is your final warning. The word final had been bolded. I folded the letter slowly and slid it into my growing evidence file. The cold air stung my cheeks as I looked out across the lake. Someone wasn't just angry. They were scared. Not of me, but of what might be uncovered. I stepped inside the cabin, the warmth from the fireplace rolling over me. Rusty curled at my feet as I placed the anonymous letter beside the violation papers, survey photos, and Jasmine's stamped documents. Whatever Miranda was hiding, whatever the board was covering up, it was deeper than a dock. The waterline had become a crime scene, and for the first time I realized the fight wasn't between me and the HOA anymore. It was between truth and whatever they'd tried to bury beneath 30 feet of lumber. The next couple of days fell into an eerie kind of quiet. Not peaceful, no, nothing close to that. It was the kind of stillness you get when the woods go silent right before a blizzard, or when the lake freezes over in a single night. The air felt too heavy, too expectant, like the whole neighborhood had braced itself but wasn't ready to admit why. Rusty stayed close. Even inside the cabin, he lay near the door, ears flicking at every sound out on the gravel road. Something in the air stirred him the same way it stirred me. I spent those mornings organizing everything: deeds, printed emails, time-stamped photos, boundary documents, the anonymous letters. All of it went into a thick binder labeled in bold letters: HOA incident, Ward property. I knew there would come a day when I'd need every scrap of proof, maybe soon. Around dawn on the third morning, a low rumble drifted through the trees. Not thunder, not a truck hauling firewood. Something smaller, sharper. A tow truck. It stopped right at the edge of my driveway with a hiss of brakes and a clatter of chains. Rusty bolted to the window, barking loud enough to shake the glass. I stepped onto the porch just as the driver hopped out. A younger guy in a beanie and faded jacket, looking more confused than threatening. He carried a clipboard tucked under his arm and walked toward my flatbed trailer full of dock lumber. "Morning," he said, voice uncertain. "Here to pick up the community materials?" "Community?" I asked, coming down the steps. "You mean those beams the HOA dumped on my property without permission?" He blinked. They said this wood was illegally taken and needed to be returned." I let out a slow exhale, then walked to my garage door and pulled down the sheriff's boundary photos, printed large, pinned to a corkboard so anyone who walked up could see. "You touch that trailer," I said calmly, "and I'll have to file for attempted theft and trespass." The driver's eyes darted between the photos, Rusty's low growl and the snow-dusted lawn. He pulled out his phone and stepped back to the truck. A short call later, he gave a stiff nod. "Sorry," he said. I was told this belonged to the HOA. It doesn't. I get that now. He backed off quickly, and within a minute the tow truck disappeared down the road, leaving only exhaust fumes curling in the cold air. But the moment he left, the quiet felt somehow heavier, like Miranda was hitting the limit of her petty tricks and preparing something bigger. Word spread. I knew it did because neighbors passed by more often than usual, walking dogs that didn't need walking, carrying empty grocery bags, or pretending to check their mail even though the mailbox flags hadn't moved. They slowed when they reached my driveway. Their eyes lingered on the trailer full of dismantled dock beams, on the county stakes marking the shoreline, on the binder I often carried outside as I sorted documents on the porch table. Most didn't say a word, but their glances said plenty. Something was unraveling, and everyone could feel it. Later that afternoon, I set up my drone, something I bought after a wildfire came dangerously close 2 summers back, and flew it over the lake, capturing wide shots of the shoreline, the disturbed sediment, the exact footprint where the illegal dock had been. I saved each image, each video, each GPS tag. When I landed the drone, a noise drifted across the water, the soft slam of a car door. I looked up. Miranda stood beside a dark sedan parked along the road. She wasn't alone. Someone sat behind the wheel, face hidden, but Miranda leaned in as if reporting a sighting or taking instructions. She pointed toward my property more than once. Then she glanced my way. The look she gave me wasn't anger anymore. It was something colder, calculating. She hurried back into the sedan, and it drove off without headlights, even though the sun was sinking low. Rusty whined. "I know," I said. "We're not done." By evening, a dusting of snow settled across the lawn, softening the outlines of the stakes and footprints. The lake's surface darkened to a mirror of clouds and fading orange light. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, the steam rising into the winter dusk. Everything looked quiet. Too quiet. Most people misunderstand silence. They think it's a lull in action, a break in momentum, a peaceful pause. But silence can be a warning, a gathering. A breath held too long. The lake hummed low under the forming ice. The trees stood still, branches growing stiff in the cold. Even the wind seemed to hold itself back, as if waiting for someone to make the next move. Inside the cabin, I spread out everything on the kitchen table. Deeds, maps, letters, violation notices, screenshots, drone footage. I organized them into sections, dates aligned, documents labeled, gaps identified. Then, at the back of the binder, I kept a page titled Missing Pieces. 3 bullet points. Why build the dock specifically on my shore? Who is she talking to in the sedan? What was the rush to finish it before I returned? The longer I stared at the list, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about a dock. This wasn't about lake access. And it definitely wasn't about community improvement. Something else drove Miranda. Money, power, or something buried deeper. And whatever her plan had been, I had ruined it by tearing the dock apart. Rusty came to rest beside me, head on my boot, sighing deeply as the wind picked up again outside. I closed the binder and looked out at the lake one last time before turning in. Some storms arrive with thunder and lightning. Others arrive with silence. This one was the second kind, and I knew the loud part wasn't far behind. It arrived on the morning of the 4th day. Loud not in volume, but in consequence. I was tightening the hinges on my back deck, trying to keep busy while the wind pushed thin snowflakes across the lake, when 2 vehicles rolled up my gravel drive. Not HOA cars, not local patrol. These were official. A Navy state sedan and a county SUV, tires crackling across frozen grit. Rusty barked before the engines shut off. 2 people stepped out, each carrying an air of quiet authority. The first was a tall man with a trimmed beard and dark winter coat, flipping open a badge with practiced ease. "Detective Nolan Briggs, County Property Crimes Division," he said. The second, a sharp-eyed woman in a charcoal wool jacket, held up her own credentials. "Mara Dalton, State Auditor's Office." They approached with purpose but not hostility, boots sinking slightly into the frost-hardened earth. Behind them, the lake glimmered in strips of weak winter sunlight. "Mr. Ward," Briggs said, "we'd like to talk to you about the dock that was built on your shoreline." I nodded once. I figured something was coming. Dalton cracked a small, humorless smile. "You were right to report what you did. Your complaint triggered a deeper review." "Of the dock?" I asked. "Of the HOA," she corrected. The wind pushed a cold gust between us, rattling the bare branches overhead. I led them to the porch where we could talk out of the direct wind. Rusty lay beside my chair, watching every movement like a sentinel. Dalton set a folder on the table, flipping it open to reveal printed maps, diagrams, and a suspicious-looking document stamped with an official-looking seal. "Mr. Ward," she said, "were you ever informed that your shoreline had been reclassified as a community access reserve?" I blinked. "Reclassified? Never. That shoreline has been mine since the day I bought this property." Briggs nodded toward the map. "The HOA submitted a document to the county claiming your shoreline had been redesignated for community use, essentially removing your exclusive rights." My pulse tightened. "They forged that?" Dalton tapped the corner of the map. "This isn't the original plat. The designation Community Reserve doesn't exist anywhere in the historical records." She slid another paper forward. "This was attached to a capital improvement request submitted by the HOA. That request unlocked nearly $30,000 from reserve funds." 30,000. I leaned forward, my breath fogging in the cold air. "Who got that money?" "That's where it gets interesting," Dalton said. She lifted a printed statement from the folder. "The money was supposedly paid to Garland Shoreline Services, a contractor used for other lake communities." "But," I prompted. "But Garland Shoreline Services never received the funds," Briggs said. "We traced the payment. It was rerouted." Dalton's finger landed on a name circled in red ink. Maxine Kessler, Miranda's sister. I exhaled hard. The air felt too thin. So Miranda forged a shoreline reclassification, submitted a fake map, claimed my land as community property, used it to justify a dock, and siphoned money? "Correct," Dalton said. "And the contractor who actually built the dock for her, unlicensed, paid cash under the table." Briggs crossed his arms. "This isn't a simple HOA dispute anymore. This is fraud, multiple counts, potential conspiracy." Rusty growled low, picking up the tension. A quiet stretched across the porch, broken only by the distant crackle of thin ice along the water's edge. I steadied myself. "What do you need from me?" Dalton slid over an evidence collection form. "A formal statement. Everything you saw, everything you documented. Dates, trespassing footage, the dock removal, any letters or threats." I nodded. "I have it all." Briggs leaned forward. "There's more. We found emails between board members requesting invoices for shoreline engineering assessments that were never conducted, and Miranda signed off on all of them." I felt a chill crawl down my spine. This one not from the winter wind. "And the dock?" I asked. Dalton shook her head. "It was the trigger. Your land was chosen because your shoreline has the most stable bank for construction. It was strategic. They needed a physical project to justify withdrawing the funds." "Why not build it on common land?" I asked. "Because," Briggs said, "the board thought you were out of town long enough not to notice. One board member even wrote, and I quote, 'Ward won't be back until next week. We can have it built before then.'" A long silence followed. Rusty nudged my leg, sensing something heavy in the air. The lake gave a faint groan under shifting wind. Winter's quiet complaint. Dalton gathered her papers. We're pursuing warrants for HOA financial records, but your cooperation will strengthen the case. You'll have it, I said. As they stood to leave, Briggs added, Mr. Ward, be prepared. Miranda won't take this quietly. I watched the two officials walk back to their vehicles, frost crunching beneath their steps. When the engine started, a plume of exhaust rose into the still air like a warning flag. The lake felt different, no longer just a place of quiet mornings and fishing lines. It had become evidence, proof, a witness. And as the cars disappeared down the road, I realized the storm had finally broken open. Everything up until now, the violations, the fake compliance officer, the anonymous letters, had only been Miranda's warm-up. The real fight was here. Not petty, not personal, criminal. And for the first time since this started, I knew I wasn't facing it alone. But knowing that didn't prepare me for what came next. That evening, as the last of the weak winter sunlight slid behind the ridge, someone knocked on my door. 3 soft taps, hesitant, careful. Rusty lifted his head and barked twice before falling quiet again, tail thumping slowly as if he recognized the visitor's scent. I opened the door to find an older man, bundled in a wool coat, leaning slightly on a cane. His face was lined, his eyes sharp and steady. I recognized him vaguely from down the road. He lived in the cedar-sided house with the stone chimney. "Elias Ward?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He extended his hand. "Name's Henry Paxton, retired judge." That caught my attention. "Judge?" He nodded, stepping inside when I motioned him in. The warmth of the cabin seemed to soften him slightly. He set a 6-pack of local ale on the table like it was a peace offering. "I brought these," he said. "Figured you might need one. Or all 6. I cracked a smile despite myself. "You're not wrong." We sat at the kitchen table, the lake visible through the frosted glass behind him. Henry tapped the wood with a slow rhythm as he studied the binder I'd laid out. Maps, letters, time-stamped photos, violation notices, the forged shoreline designation. "Miranda overplayed her hand," he murmured. "She's been getting bolder every month. But this dock business," he shook his head. "Illegal construction on private land, forged documents, misuse of HOA funds. She's crossed into something she can't talk her way out of." "What made you come here?" I asked. He set his hands over the 6-pack and sighed. "The auditor and detective visited me today, asked questions about the HOA, about past expenditures, about patterns of behavior." His gaze drifted to the shoreline. I told them what I knew. "And what do you know?" "That Miranda's been treating this community like her personal fiefdom for years, and most folks were too tired or too scared to push back." Rusty pressed against my leg, sensing the shift in the room. Henry leaned closer, lowering his voice. "There's going to be a reckoning, Elias, and the community needs someone steady when it happens." Before I could respond, another knock came at the door. This time it wasn't soft. It was angry. Rusty growled, deep and thunderous. I opened the door to find a cluster of residents on the porch, 6 or 7 neighbors bundled in coats and scarves, breath drifting like smoke. Some I recognized, others I'd only seen from a distance. Their faces were tense, troubled, drawn with weeks of whispered rumors. A tall woman stepped forward. "We heard county officials were here," she said. "Is it true? Did the HOA really break environmental laws? And did they forge maps?" another asked. "Because that's what folks are saying." Henry rose from the table and joined me at the doorway. His presence seemed to steady the crowd. "Everyone," he said, "come in or gather around, but keep your voices low. This isn't the time for panic." We ended up on the porch, steam rising from everyone's breath as snowflakes drifted lazily around us. Some neighbors stood. Others sat on the steps. The lake behind us glowed faintly with the reflection of porch light, rippling gently against the stakes the county had left behind. I explained what I could, carefully, without speculation. The forged shoreline document, the rerouted funds, the unlicensed contractor, the investigation underway. Every word landed like a weight dropping into the lake. "I knew it," muttered a man with a baseball cap pulled low. "She raised the dues last year, said it was for irrigation repairs. Nothing ever got fixed. And the playground renovation," another said. "We paid for it twice." "She's been lying to all of us," whispered an older woman. "For how long?" Henry raised a hand. "This is why we need to be smart, not reactive. An emergency meeting needs to be called, not by the current board, but by the homeowners themselves." The tall woman nodded. "We need accountability." "And transparency," another neighbor added. "And someone who understands what's going on," said a man near the steps. He looked straight at me. "Elias, you've done more in a week than we've done in a year." I felt Rusty's warm weight against my leg, grounding me. "I'm not looking to lead anything," I said quietly. Henry stepped forward, placing a firm hand on my shoulder. "Sometimes leadership isn't something you seek. Sometimes it comes when the truth chooses you." The porch fell silent. Only the wind through the pine branches broke the stillness, carrying the scent of distant snow and frozen earth. That evening, the homeowners drafted a petition. 28 signatures gathered in less than an hour, authorizing an emergency community meeting to question the HOA board. The paper felt heavy in my hands, not just from the ink, but from the weight of what it represented. A community finally waking up. I promised I'd attend the meeting, though in truth, I still felt the ground shifting beneath my feet. This wasn't just my fight anymore. It belonged to all of us. As the neighbors dispersed into the cold, Henry lingered. "You need to be ready, Elias," he said, gripping his cane. "People like Miranda. They don't go down quietly. When cornered, they lash out." "Let her," I said, voice low and steady. "This time she's cornering herself." Henry nodded. "Tomorrow evening, the clubhouse. Bring your evidence." After he left, I stood on the porch for a long moment, watching the snow settle lightly on the stakes along the shoreline. The lake shimmered under the faint moonlight, quiet and deceptively calm. Inside, Rusty nudged my hand until I scratched behind his ears. "Storm's coming, boy," I whispered. But this time I wasn't standing alone on the shoreline. I had a community at my back, and the truth on my side. The next morning, the lake lay still, glassy under a pale gray sky. A thin layer of ice clung to the shallows, cracking softly whenever a breeze rolled across it. Rusty paced near the window, tail flicking. He sensed the tension before I did. At first, it was only a faint hum in the distance, an engine cutting through the cold air. Then another, and another. I stepped out onto the porch just as two vehicles turned onto the gravel road, a dark blue State Patrol SUV. Behind it, a county sheriff's sedan. Both slowed in unison, tires crackling across frost-hardened dirt. The cars stopped near my drive. Doors opened. Uniforms stepped out. This wasn't a visit. This was an operation. Rusty barked sharply, then fell quiet as if he understood the weight of what he was seeing. The sheriff's deputy from earlier approached me. "Mr. Ward," he said, "you'll want to see this." I followed him to the road. Up the slope, outside Miranda's home, a large two-story with a wraparound porch and artificial potted plants, officers were already assembling. One read from a clipboard. Another adjusted a body cam. A pair of state police stood by the steps, frost clinging to their jackets. Then Miranda herself burst through the front door. Her hair was wild, her pink cardigan thrown on over a nightgown. No sunglasses this time, no clipboard. Just shock, anger, and fear in equal measure. "What is the meaning of this?" she shouted, voice cracking through the cold. "You can't just show up at my house." A state officer calmly read her rights. "Miranda Kessler, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, falsification of public records, and misuse of community funds." Her jaw dropped. "That's absurd. I run this neighborhood." The officer didn't respond. He gently took her arm as she staggered back, sputtering. "You can't. No, this is harassment. This is retaliation. It's because of him." Her wild eyes snapped toward me. "He's orchestrated all of this. He's lying, fabricating, manipulating." Her voice broke as handcuffs clicked around her wrists. The moment froze in time. The porch steps, the officers, the pale winter light, Miranda's panicked breathing, and the unmistakable truth crashing down on her shoulders. As they guided her toward the patrol SUV, she shouted one final accusation. "You think you've won, Elias? You just wait. You'll see. This isn't over." But it was. And it wasn't just her. Another board member, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses, was escorted out of his house 1 block down, arrested for obstruction and failure to report known wrongdoing. A third attempted to slip out the back door of his home, only to be intercepted by 2 officers. The treasurer wasn't so lucky. He tried to make a run for it in an old sedan, but the sheriff's car cut him off at the intersection. They pulled him from the vehicle, hands raised, trembling as he begged for leniency. I stood at the edge of my property with Rusty, watching the scene unfold like a slow-motion avalanche. Neighbors emerged from their homes, bundled in coats and scarves, arms crossed against the cold, as blue and red lights reflected off icy windows. For the first time since this started, people weren't whispering. They were speaking openly. She forged the shoreline map. I knew something was off with the dues. This is what happens when power gets unchecked. Elias tried to warn us. About time. Then came the news van, Channel 5, same one that covered county issues. A reporter stepped out, hair whipping in the wind, camera crew right behind her. They filmed everything, the patrol cars, the arrests, the boarded-up HOA office down near the community entrance. A drone lifted into the sky, panning across the lake, capturing the staked shoreline and the empty space where the illegal dock once stood. By noon, the headline was already online. HOA president arrested in Willow Shores, fraud scandal. Illegal dock construction, sparks. Criminal investigation, neighbors huddled together near the community sign, watching the scene unfold. Some apologized to me quietly. Others simply met my eyes with the kind of expression people wear when they realize they've been complicit by silence. The state auditor, Mara Dalton, arrived shortly after the arrests were made. She spotted me near the road and walked over, her breath rising in steady clouds. "Mr. Ward," she said, "just thought you should know. The governor's office has been briefed. Given the scope of the fraud, the misuse of environmental permits, and the forged documents, the HOA's authority is being suspended pending a full audit." I blinked. "Suspended? Entirely?" She nodded. "Effective immediately. No more citations. No more fines. No more enforcement. The board is dissolved until further notice." The wind shifted across the lake, stirring thin ripples against the broken ice. Mara continued. "A state-appointed financial monitor will take over. Once the audit concludes, there will likely be restitution hearings." It was like hearing the final piece of a long, complicated puzzle fall into place. The HOA wasn't just losing power. It was being gutted from the inside. Neighbors began clapping. Not loud, not celebratory, just a soft ripple of relief. An exhale years in the making. One woman approached me, face flushed with cold. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for standing up when the rest of us didn't." Another man nodded. "You saved this community." I shook my head. "I just protected my land." Henry Paxton arrived shortly after, cane tucked under one arm, his breath catching when he saw the patrol cars pulling away. "Well," he said, "I've presided over a lot of courtroom surprises in my day, but this one takes the cake." "Feels surreal," I admitted. "It should," he replied. "Justice always feels a bit surreal when it finally lands." By late afternoon, quiet returned to the neighborhood, but it wasn't the tense, suffocating quiet from before. This was a release, a loosening, the sound of an entire community resetting. As the sun dipped low, I stood at the shoreline with Rusty at my feet. The cold wind painted the lake with streaks of gold, shimmering across open water. The war Miranda tried to start? It had ended where it began, on my land, and the truth had won the day. But there was still one chapter left. One final step before any of us could truly breathe. The community needed to rebuild, and I needed to decide what came next. For the first time in weeks, I let myself feel something new. Hope. Not the fragile kind. Not the sort that flickers once and disappears. This felt steady, earned. The kind that settles in your chest like a warm coal on a winter morning, glowing slow and sure. The day after the arrests, Willow Shores felt like a different world. No patrol cars, no HOA vehicles, no compliance division trucks creeping around with cameras. Just quiet, natural quiet. The kind that had drawn me to this lake years ago. Snow had dusted the lawns overnight, frosting rooftops and bending pine branches under its weight. The lake shimmered beneath a pale sun, faint ripples moving across the shoreline, where the illegal dock had once stood like an open wound. Rusty trotted beside me as I walked down to the water. Thin ice cracked softly under my boots. The stakes the surveyor had driven into the soil still stood in neat rows, each one a small monument to the truth. For the first time since this started, the shoreline looked like mine again, whole, untouched. Around mid-morning, neighbors began to gather near the community clubhouse, a squat wooden building with cedar siding and a faded sign. Smoke curled from its chimney, the first sign of life it had shown in months. Folks walked up in twos and threes, bundled in coats, stomping snow off their boots. This was the emergency meeting the homeowners themselves had demanded. When Rusty and I arrived, the room was already crowded. Folding chairs lined the walls, and the low hum of conversations filled the air. Some neighbors nodded when they saw me. Others came over with quiet thanks or apologetic smiles. Henry Paxton waved me over to the front row. His cane rested against the arm of his chair, and he wore the expression of a man preparing to oversee a courtroom again. "Big day," he said. "Feels like a turning point," I replied. "It is." The remaining HOA board members, those not arrested or under investigation, sat at the front of the room looking less like leaders and more like defendants waiting for sentencing. One clutched a stack of papers, another fidgeted with a pen. Their eyes kept drifting toward the door, as if hoping someone else would walk in and take their place. But it was too late for that. A woman named Teresa, who lived on the East Trail, stood up. "We're here because we've lost trust," she said. "Because our community was bullied, misled, and silenced. Because our money was taken. Because our land rights were violated. And because we let one person run wild for too long." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. She continued, "This meeting isn't about vengeance. It's about rebuilding something we forgot we could protect. Our home." Henry leaned forward. "We must remove the current board. All of them." One of the remaining board members, a thin, nervous man, rose shakily. We didn't know what Miranda was doing," he stammered. "She handled most finances. We trusted her. We had no idea about the forged documents." Henry raised a hand, and the room fell silent. "Trust is not a defense," he said softly. "It's a responsibility." And you failed it. A vote was called. Every hand went up except for 2 abstentions from the back row. In under a minute, the HOA board was officially dissolved. Henry then addressed the room. Until a special election can be held, we appoint a temporary oversight panel of 3 homeowners who have never served on the board. They will manage community affairs transparently, with open books and full accountability. Names were proposed, arguments exchanged, and then the vote came. Henry was elected interim trustee by an overwhelming margin. The second seat went to Lewis, the high school principal known for calming heated PTA meetings. The third name caught me by surprise. "Elias Ward," someone called from the back. Heads turned. More voices followed. "He's the only one who stood up. He has the evidence. He won't let something like this happen again. He knows the law better than any of us." I stood, stunned. "Folks, I didn't do this to lead anything. I only defended my land." "And that," Henry said, "is why we trust you." The vote was quick and unanimous. I took the seat beside them, Rusty lying dutifully at my feet. A strange mix of humility and responsibility settled over me. I had never asked for this. But maybe this was what justice looked like. Not punishment, but rebuilding. The rest of the meeting rolled through reports, open questions, and stories of dues mismanagement. People spoke freely now, voices rising and falling like waves on the lake. By afternoon, the audit task force had formed. Documents were collected, volunteers assigned. The old HOA office, a rented trailer near the entry gate, was sealed by county order. Outside, the cold air hit with the sharp scent of pine and smoke. Neighbors lingered, chatting, relieved. Some even laughed, a sound I hadn't heard around here in months. Henry walked up beside me. "You did good in there. I just told the truth. Sometimes that's the hardest thing to do." We walked back toward my cabin, the snow crunching under our boots. Rusty bounded ahead, happy for the fresh, cold air. "What'll you do with the dock lumber?" Henry asked. "I've been thinking about that," I said. The following morning, I loaded the trailer with the salvaged beams, now dry and stacked neatly. I drove into town to the Veterans Fishing Program, a small nonprofit that built public access docks for disabled vets and wounded anglers. The volunteer coordinator teared up when I donated the entire load. "This'll help build a new floating platform downriver," he said, shaking my hand. "We'll put your community's name on a plaque." "Just make sure it's built right," I said with a small smile. He laughed. "Yes, sir." Back home, the lake was calm again. The stakes along the shoreline stood firm, catching the sunlight in thin amber glints. The water shimmered with a clean, unbroken surface. My land, my peace. Henry stopped by just after sunrise, carrying 2 cups of steaming coffee. "Back page," he said, handing me a folded newspaper. The headline read, "DA pursues additional charges in Willow Shore's HOA scandal treasurer, accused of attempted offshore transfer." I let out a slow breath. It just keeps unraveling, doesn't it? "Rot always does," Henry said, "given time and sunlight." We sat on the porch, sipping coffee as Rusty lay between us, tail tapping gently on the wood. The winter light shifted across the lake, bouncing in soft gold waves. For a while, none of us spoke. There was no need. The lake was peaceful again. The community was standing again. And the truth, after weeks of resistance, had finally risen above the waterline. Rusty lifted his head and nudged my hand. "Yeah, boy," I whispered, running my palm over his fur. "Feels like home again." I stepped to the shoreline, boots pressing into the cold soil, and looked out over the quiet expanse. No dock, no trespass, no lies. Just water, sky, and land, exactly as they were meant to be. Justice had come full circle, and the lake finally remembered who it belonged to. If you've ever had to stand your ground against someone abusing their power, drop a yes in the comments so I know I'm not alone out here. And if you believe land, dignity, and truth are worth fighting for, hit subscribe. I've got more stories coming your way.